Don's Wife, Chapter 1. The camera was hidden in the hedge, bordering the landscaped garden around the high-rise luxury hotel. Crouching behind it, the man adjusted the focus on the silver-colored small car parked straight across. Even before he could press the shutter, he felt the cold touch of steel on his temple, followed by a click. He understood that it was a barrel of a different kind and froze in his place. A hoarse male voice growled softly, "On your knees. Come on the knees." The young man obliged and dropped himself on his knees. Hands on the head. The young photographer followed the order. Suddenly, the gun was withdrawn, and almost immediately, a broad adhesive tape was slapped on his mouth, and with even more alacrity, both his hands were taken hold of in a tight grip and pulled behind his back. Swiftly, a nylon rope was secured tightly around his wrists. Even as he winced with pain, a sharp kick landed on his side, making him fall sideways on the grass. Promptly, his legs were gripped and another rope was tied around his ankles. The photographer's eyes were almost torn with fear as a tall and fearsome-looking man in his mid-30s who had a rather attractive face walked in front of him. From the photographer's sideways and ground-level perspective, he looked giant-sized and even meaner in disposition. The intruder pressed a button on the camera and withdrew its memory card before dismounting it from the tripod and tossing it aside. He put the card in his pocket and moved closer to the photographer. He knelt down slowly without removing his eyes from the young man. With a glint in his eyes, he lifted up the photographer's face, holding him by his hair, and warned him in a guttural whisper, "Don't you even look at my future." With this, he gave a stinging slap on the photographer's face and dropped him on the grass. The woman, dressed only in a petticoat and plunging bra, emerged from the washroom and took tentative steps to the bedside table. She picked up a packet of cigarettes lying on it. She withdrew a cigarette and put back the packet on the small table nearby. An attractive woman in her early 40s, she oozed sensuality as she turned and somewhat pensively walked to the window while putting the cigarette in her lips. She seemed to peer into the diffuse light outside in a state of uncertainty before she turned back and took a step to the coffee table to pick up a lighter. Once again she turned around and with a lurking sadness in her eyes took a thoughtful step towards the window, overlooking the lawns of the hotel many stories below. She was about to light her cigarette, but stopped just before she would have done so, with the flame still blazing in the lighter. After a long, brooding pause, she put out the flame and slowly bent down sideways to put the lighter on the coffee table. She crushed the unlit cigarette in the ashtray. She picked up a glass, already half filled with whiskey, and took a gulp as she straightened and faced the window again, her moodiness creeping into her slowly, mysteriously. It was much darker outside now. In the reflection on the window pane, she saw the entrance door of the room open and a man enter. The same man who had roughed up the photographer earlier. He threw a glance at her as he crossed the short corridor and went to the cigarette packet lying on the bedside table. He withdrew 2 cigarettes and put them both in his lips before walking to the woman. He stopped behind her and bent over to pick up the lighter. He lit both the cigarettes in his mouth before withdrawing one and offering it to her over her shoulder. The lady responded softly, "No." "Why?" "I have given up." "When?" "Just now." The man seemed intrigued and took a step to come beside and looked at her searchingly, while she stood stoically, continuing to peer outside. He slowly lowered himself on the armrest of the sofa chair while continuing to stare at her face. After the silence of a couple of seconds, the lady pulled the curtains shut and turned to face him before saying, "I have taken 2 vows just now." "What is the second vow?" asked the man calmly, betraying a trace of loneliness in his voice. Without moving her eyes, the woman replied in a slightly injured tone. "Second one is that after today, we shall not meet like this, like thieves." The man stared at her silently, his face showing curiousness. The lady continued, "It doesn't matter if we don't meet, but not like this." Both exchanged pained looks. She continued, "Jayant, I can't bear it anymore." "Would it be possible? Not meeting, I mean?" "Perhaps not," the lady said after a thoughtful pause. "Then, why can't we get married?" His tone seemed a little more injured. A pained silence followed again, as they merely stared at each other. Then she dropped her eyes and walked away towards the wardrobe, while saying somewhat resignedly, "Let's move. I've got to leave." She opened the wardrobe and took out her sari. His eyes followed her as she crossed the room and entered the washroom. He extinguished the cigarettes and stared at the span of the room vacantly for a few seconds. Then he slowly walked up to the washroom too. He saw her reflection in the mirror through the door which was ajar. As she adjusted the sari, she too noticed him, but chose to say nothing. After the final touch to her lipstick, she straightened and said somberly, "Day after tomorrow, I'll be returning from Pune. I would have taken the decision by then. Could it be in my favor, the decision?" Without uttering a word, the lady stopped in her tracks for a couple of seconds. Then she spoke softly, though in a non-committal tone. "It might." Jan also held her eyes silently as he understood the tricky hopelessness of the situation. Then he dropped his eyes, and as the lady turned back to the mirror, he looked up and addressed her image. "Whatever may your decision be, Kamini, can I request you to let me accompany you for this Pune visit? Please?" She turned around brusquely and said with slight irritation, "Come on, Jan. You know the situation. Officially, you are no longer my bodyguard. Another bodyguard has already been assigned the job. In such a situation, you coming with me? You know what it means? But do you realize what it means? He retorted slightly curtly. Then he said with concern, you know you have been attacked before, Kamini. This new man, would he be able to protect you properly? How can you be so sure? No, I cannot be sure. But what difference does it make? At least the impression would be that I have a bodyguard. Otherwise also, I don't think that now, even after so many years, Harsh's and my enemies would want to shoot me. On the contrary, she returned to the mirror, remarking with a smirk, the greater danger these days is from these photographers, who always seem to be on the lookout to target you and me. You have the answer for everything, Jayant said a little resignedly. Kamini, who had already finished her chores, turned to face him and said conciliatorily, Jayant, don't be like that. She paused and then asked warmly, okay, tell me, what should I bring for you from Pune? You, he said, after a thoughtful pause. Later on, when Jayant was seated alone, nursing his drink at the bar of the hotel to give the pre-agreed head start to Kamini, who had driven away on her own, little did he know that another man in the bar was keeping an eye on him and had even photographed him secretly, just as he had done with Kamini. Indeed, he was smarter than the amateur at the lawn, as he had used the miniature spy camera all the while. Almost stealthily, Kamini's car glided in through the smaller back gate already held open by her trusted security guard. Whenever she sneaked out on her own, like she did today, she always travelled in a smaller, inconspicuous car instead of her Mercedes and used the back gate. She put up the handbrake and alighted without turning off the ignition. She opened the back door to pick up her handbag and shut it softly before moving away. Immediately the guard slid in to softly reverse the car towards the garage. Kamini walked down the narrow paver path amid the shrubs to reach the back door of the bungalow. Even before she could knock on it, the door opened softly to reveal a woman in her late 50s, attired in a working woman's sari and blouse, who let her in. Kamini gave a fleeting, though meaningful glance at the woman as she passed her at the doorway to enter the small sitting room, used more as a utility room. As she dropped her handbag on the small settee, the old woman addressed her in Marathi. तुम्ही फ्रेश होऊन घ्या, मी जीवन लावते. You freshen up, I'll lay the dinner. हो, पण मला भूक नाही आहे. Yes, but I am not hungry, she said briefly, then asked, has Meenu eaten? नहीं. Okay, you go to sleep, I'll see. हो. Kamini threw another glance at the other woman and left the room. She entered a tastefully furnished bedroom. Her daughter Mrinalini, a young girl in her early teens, was busy with her homework. Several reference books lay open on the table in the corner of the room. She did not take notice of her mother's arrival and continued to compare the figures in a notebook with the data displayed on the LCD monitor in front of her. Kamini walked up to the table and stood there without saying anything. Her daughter also said nothing and remained preoccupied with her work. Kamini pulled a chair and sat down near her. She sensed the tension and leaned forward to look at her before asking softly, Meenu, Why didn't you have your dinner yet, beta? The girl did not answer. Her eyes remained fixed on her work. Kamini asked again, Meenu, I'm asking something. Meenu still did not answer. Kamini persisted, a little curtly this time. Meenu, I said, why didn't you have your dinner? Meenu still remained defiantly silent. Kamini stared at her with traces of anger and exasperation showing on her face. She put her hand under Meenu's chin and turned her face towards herself before demanding, Meenu, when I ask a question, I expect an answer. Meenu merely stared into her eyes, betraying a definite alienation. After a tense silence, she spoke in a cold and composed tone. I too, Mummy. When I also ask something, I expect an answer too. Kamini was perplexed. She removed her hand and asked in a slightly injured tone, What question of yours have I not answered? None spoke, merely exchanged steely looks. Tell me, bete. Leave it. You know too well the things you are doing. Meenu completed slightly contemptuously. I find it dirty to even talk about them. Meenu, you are getting more and more ill-mannered as you are getting older, Kamini said brusquely. I may be getting ill-mannered, but at least not shameless, she was defiant. On a sudden reflex, Kamini slapped Meenu. A stunned Meenu stared at her mother, who was immediately remorseful. She got up in a shock and then impulsively went back to Meenu and wrapped her arms around her while saying plaintively, I'm sorry, beta. I'm really sorry. Tears of hurt flashed in Meenu's eyes and she jerked aside her mother's hand off her while saying dismissively, Please, Mummy, you smell awful. Please leave me alone. She disentangled herself from her mother and stormed out of the room. Kamini stood stupidly at her place as a condemned person. Tears flashed in her eyes too. Slowly she gathered herself and turned around to leave the room. She felt very lonely, like a guilty person who has just been thrashed for her indiscretions. Slowly she too left the room.